Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you know you can take the Lunch Hour with you wherever you want to go. Just check us out on one of the many fine podcast platforms the Lunch Hour is on that are out there. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you can check out what's happening in studio by going and checking out our YouTube page. Subscribe, leave us a like. Mash down on that thumbs up button, leave us a review, but most importantly, let your friends and family members and your family members' friends know that you're liking and enjoying the Lunch Hour. That certainly helps us here. Excited as always to bring our next guest on. His name is Thomas Hochman. He is a policy manager with the Foundation for American Innovation. We're going to get into what FAI is all about. He works on regulatory and infrastructure policy. His research and writing has appeared in American Affairs, The Hill, National Review, The New Atlantis, the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and elsewhere. And he's got a big brain. He holds a BS in mathematical studies from the University of Vermont. We're going to ask him later on how somebody goes to the University of Vermont and comes out engaged in sort of the free market limited government side of things. But Thomas, I wanted to have you on because we had a conversation about the work you're doing on state-based regulatory issues, the relationship with federal issues, and the issue of permitting and implementation plans. Obviously, not that we're going to talk about the election right now, because by the time we put this out, the election will have already happened. But one of the things we're all talking about here is the issue of permitting and red tape. Tell us about the relationship between state and local regulation, permitting, and federal mandates and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, well, first of all, Andrew, thanks for having me on. Great
Always.
To be here. So state permitting is a really interesting and I think under-leveraged issue. In general, I think when we think of regulations, particularly permitting rules, we think of them as being these federal laws where states really don't have a ton of influence over what they look like. But as it would turn out, a lot of these federal laws are what you might call delegated to the state level. So while they're the sort of overall overarching rules are set by the EPA or another agency or by Congress, states have quite a bit of bandwidth in deciding how they meet those rules.
Right.
So something like 75 to 80% of federal permitting laws are implemented at the state level. And then states, of course, often have their own environmental laws that they pass themselves. So when we talk about, why is it hard to build things here in the United States and what are the regulations that are holding back economic development? Oftentimes we actually really should be looking to the states. And I think, certainly there are folks who are working on this, but right now a lot of the attention is focused on the federal level and for good reason. But I think there's still a lot more opportunity to think about the states as well.
Well, and we're gonna dive deep into the issue areas that you've been working on. But I know one of the problems that at least I've seen over the last 30 plus years is the issue of state and federal agencies pointing fingers at each other in terms of the blame when something goes sideways in terms of a permitting process. And let's say somebody can't make the reasonable and productive use of their property. Where do they go to challenge it? Now, I'm a firm believer in federalism, right? I believe in what Justice O'Connor said: federalism secures to individuals the liberties that derive from the diffusion of sovereign power. But when you have the federal government making these mandates and the states in charge of implementing them, it gets very confusing in terms of how and who to hold accountable, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this strange thing where oftentimes the EPA, this federal agency, has to sign off on what the state chooses to do. But it's incredibly hard for the states even to hold the EPA accountable, right? So to give you one example of how this might work, the states or Texas had designed this flexible permit program for the Clean Air Act. And it went to the EPA to get the EPA to sign off on this program so they could start issuing these permits. Now, technically, according to the law, the EPA has 1 year to sign off on the program.
Wow.
But there's really no way to hold the EPA accountable, right? Because if the EPA takes longer, you could sue, but that would just extend the process even more. So in the end, it took the EPA 16 years to make a decision on this flexible permit program. In the meantime,
so much for flexibility. If I was going to go ahead and quit, wow.
Yeah, right.
Go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and Texas had just started issuing these permits after the EPA hadn't acted after a decade. So the EPA finally made this decision 16 years later, and their decision was to reject the program. And so it left all of these facilities in limbo. Now, Texas challenged the decision and won in the end. But it's sort of, I think this really typifies how much of a problem this federalist structure can be when there's no way to hold federal agencies accountable.
Right. On the property rights side of things, on the Clean Water Act side, there was this thing called the Tucker Act Shuffle, in which, the states and the federal government, you go back and forth in these challenges. Ultimately, invariably, the question would be mooted by some other sort of circumstance out there. I mean, in this kind of situation, so Texas went ahead and issued the permits. Actually, let's take a step back and look at the process here. Yeah. So the federal government puts out a set of mandates. We have these state implementation plans that go out there. The states engage in them. So the states, they have their own version of the Administrative Procedure Act, don't they? Whereby they come up with these plans, they solicit public input. And then then goes back to the federal government for the public to go and comment on them as well. Is that under the Administrative Procedure Act?
Yeah, that's right. I think the Administrative Procedure Act is the vehicle, although I don't know with certainty what that sort of second step looks like. But that's right. Yeah. So states are required for the Clean Air Act. It was due to a 1990 amendment to the Clean Air Act, which said states are responsible. And states have to fill out these official state implementation plans, send it to the EPA, and the EPA basically has to be able to determine that the state's plan will result in the state meeting the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAAQS.
NAICS standards, yeah.
Yeah, right. But the point is that there are a number of different ways, like flexible permits, that you can basically reduce the procedural barriers while still meeting those substantive requirements. But states are often incentivized away from designing these new concepts or these new mechanisms because the EPA takes so long to sign off on them. Well,
and that's you said, right? In the end, the goal should be the goal, and of course, this is the thing that gets me after 16 years, right? Part of the problem is that depending on changes, I mean, that's essentially 4 separate presidential administrations in which the priorities of an agency can change and how they go back and forth. When we're talking about ambient air quality standards, right, we're talking about, particulate matter, or we're talking about substances that get emitted. EPA over the course of a decade and a half can radically change, those standards. So how does a state, if it takes a state 16 years, what do they do in that time frame?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right. And the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, it's been a one-way ratchet, right? They just get tightened and tightened and tightened. You're not allowed to consider economic impact when you set them. And so, when over the course of 16 years, it actually, the standard that your program has to meet changes. And that's an enormous problem.
I mean, because that's just it. I mean, presumably what the EPA's decision would be is, well, when we set the NAICS standard, the ambient air quality standard, we conducted our analysis there. And I guess that's part of the problem with the EPA conducting the NAICS standard to set the implementation plan for the states, is that, they don't necessarily take into account the disparate economic impacts that might happen. I mean, the impact to set a standard in Texas and in certain areas in Texas is going to be different than setting that standard for Montana or Idaho or Oregon. And that's a problem, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, and they also don't consider how many areas are currently in compliance with the last NAICS that they set, which is also a problem, right? Because right. So the rules, if you are deemed non-attainment, which means that you're not in compliance with those standards in your area, are significantly stricter. In fact, some have argued that it effectively prohibits major industrial development in those non-attainment areas. But nevertheless, the EPA doesn't consider whether or not a huge number of counties or regions or areas are still in non-attainment when they ratchet the NAICS down further.
Let's take a step back here because, because I literally was having this conversation with a colleague yesterday who's learning about these things as we go along. But the three major pieces of environmental legislation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act, all enacted in the early 1970s, when America was really having a debate over the push-pull, the relationship between economic prosperity and environmental impact. And we were having a situation in which we had species that were dying, we had rivers catching on fire, and we had cities being choked with smog. So we enacted these major pieces of environmental legislation. And guess what? We don't have rivers catching on fire. We have, we could discuss the relative merits of the Endangered Species Act at another point, but we also don't have cities being choked with smog. And, but there was a cost. And there's a reason why we call, the Northeastern Industrial Corridor, or what used to be the Northeastern Industrial Corridor, the Rust Belt, is because essentially all of those businesses were forced out of business as a result of these major pieces of environmental legislation. And we can get into competitiveness and all those other things. But there has to be some recognition here. There was the question, Thomas, we didn't talk about this yesterday, but in the 1990s, the National Environmental Policy Institute engaged in an effort of reinventing the EPA effort. So we're talking 30 years ago now, that part of which had to do with the idea of how clean is clean. And this is an important issue, right? This issue of where do we get that, especially in this issue of areas that are already out of attainment being forced to get even further behind. That puts these states at a disadvantage, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%, right? I wish I had some stats off the top of my head, but I will say that Resources for the Future has done some great work on looking at how much harder it is to develop, to compete, if you're already non-attainment. It's really, it can be devastating for a local economy when you make that switch in designation from attainment to non-attainment.
Right.
So yeah, it's a huge deal.
Actually, talk about that a little bit, because again, talking about the issue of permitting and red tape and the ability of businesses to open, if your area all of a sudden goes out of attainment, talk about how that impacts the ability of businesses to form. Get into a little bit more detail on this if you can.
Yeah, so it really is. It's a completely different set of rules, right? So the Clean Air Act has one program for development in attainment areas and one program for development in non-attainment areas. The pre-construction permitting program, right? So the permit that you have to get before you build a new piece of infrastructure or make a revision to a piece of infrastructure. If you're in attainment, it's called PSD, prevention of significant deterioration, and if you're in non-attainment, it's called non-attainment new source review.
My God. Hold on for a second. This is bringing back all kinds of memories. I don't think I shared this with you when I talked. We've had him on the show before. I worked for several years, 3 years, for a blind environmental lawyer as his reader and personal assistant.
Wow.
And so you sort of had this education in environmental policy, but the concept of NSR and this is right in the wake of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. The new source review and PSD, prevention of significant deterioration. These are all coming flooding back to me. I'm sorry to interrupt. It was very rude of me, Thomas, but please continue.
No, that's good. Yeah, it must have been, especially right after the 1990 amendments, that must have been a pretty incredible time to be working in the space. So to give you one example, right, there are massive differences in the requirements for best available control technology or BACT. And this isn't just sort of this minor difference. This is enormously expensive, right? If you need to be constantly basically updating your facility to put in the new considered to be best available control technology, which by the way is also always changing.
Yes.
This is a huge challenge, right? And it drives up the upfront capital costs by however many X. And when you're making a modification, it becomes more expensive. It's just across the board. If you're trying to open a factory, or even if you're a small business owner and let's say you have a concrete batch plant or an air curtain incinerator or whatever it is, it's just subject to different rules.
Right, and it takes time. Well, let's pull it back for a little bit, because you're not only working on the air issues, but talk about the work that you're doing on the relationship between the federal mandates and the permitting process on a host of areas. Talk generally about the work that you're doing for the Foundation for American Innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should first say Foundation for American Innovation, FAI, we're a think tank in DC. Broadly, we work at this intersection of innovation and governance and national security. My work over the last several months has been building out what I'm calling a state permitting playbook. So I've gone across 32 states and looked at their implementations of 4 environmental laws. One of those is the Clean Air Act, which is this federal law that's delegated to the states. Another one is the Clean Water Act, which is a similar structure. But I'm also looking at state NEPAs, which are equivalents at the state level to the National Environmental Policy Act. So those are laws that are just passed at the state level, as well as state endangered species acts. Across the board, there's really much more opportunity than I even sort of could have hoped for improving things here. I mean, I suppose that's both a pessimistic thing to say and an optimistic thing to say, because it's for a red state to have such prohibitive environmental.
Hold on for a second. It's a realistic thing to say. I mean, the thing is what the thing is, and so you're just looking at it for what it is. But go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, absolutely. But you'll see a red state like Montana, right, which has an incredibly prohibitive state NEPA. They call it NEPA, which in some ways might even be more prohibitive than federal NEPA. And has made it incredibly hard, for example, to develop critical mineral infrastructure in the state. I was on the phone with somebody in Montana last week, and they said, look, every other state around us has this booming critical mineral industry. But because we have this law, which, we have a red legislature, right? But because we have this law, our industry isn't growing. So, it's an enormous problem. It's bad for energy infrastructure. I mean, for folks on the left, it's bad for clean energy deployment. It just gets in the way of growth.
Yeah, time out for a second, because again, sort of pulling back to the general mission of the Foundation for American Innovation, this is one of the problems that I've been talking about over the last couple of years, is that we're not even going to frame it in left and right, but it seems to me that the folks who are pushing for greater amounts of clean and or sustainable energy, depending on how you want to do it, it's almost like one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. Because on the one hand, we need to have innovation to develop these things. You need to be able to access the materials here at home. That's a national security issue. But on the other hand, there are huge restrictions, whether or not it is, putting pressure on the intellectual property system, which is going to depress the concept of innovation. I've had a couple of conversations in recent weeks about that, to going after creating new regulations that impact the chemistry industry in the United States, the folks who are going to be developing the critical materials that are going to be necessary to make energy generation and the machines that generate power lighter and more efficient. And you can't do one without the other, yet they don't seem to understand that. Also, this idea that innovation is not made in a vacuum. Talk a little bit about this with regards to the research that you're doing.
Yeah, it's really interesting seeing how the conversation about this sort of thing has developed on the left, particularly the center left, over the last few years. I think there's a couple things going on at once. I think that the Democratic Party now is now split, and the environmental movement is no longer one thing. You have the old school environmentalists who sort of came up around the time that these environmental laws that we've been talking about were passed. And then you have the climate hawks who are focused on deploying as much clean energy as quickly as possible. And the nature of the policy solutions to those two imperatives are wildly different and often not in concert with one another. But I think that only just now are those two groups coming to terms with the fact that they actually have totally different interests and really disagree with what the way forward is. But I think, more broadly, you're starting to see folks on the center left come to terms with the idea of permitting reform, but really they think of it in the context of permitting reform for clean energy or permitting reform to realize the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act or what have you. But, I think the challenge here is that it's really hard to know what the important upstream industries are that are important for innovation. It's really hard to know what the next technology, clean technology will be that will be really important. And so, I call it deregulatory favoritism, right? It's
Yes.
they're open to some deregulation, but only for favored industries.
Right.
The problem is that it takes an enormous amount of time to build up the coalition for on the left, right? I mean,
Right.
we still haven't gotten, most Democrats on board with NEPA reform, even though it stands in the way of their clean energy goals. So I think it's a structural problem, right? To kind of take this piecemeal approach to creating carve-outs for your preferred industries, and it ends up not being nearly as effective.
So let's getting more into your research. I mean, the issue of these four areas, and again, right, it's ESA, Endangered Species Act, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and NEPA. I mean, what are you finding in terms of how the states are grappling with these four areas and their implementation at the state and local level?
Yeah, I mean, certainly varies state to state. I think with state laws like state NEPAs and state Endangered Species Acts, we're really looking for subtraction, right? Removing regulatory barriers. And with Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, we're sort of looking for addition. We're looking for them to develop flexible permitting programs, develop new approaches to compliance. I think depending on the state, often a state will be good at subtraction but not addition, or good at addition but not subtraction. So, Wyoming, for example, doesn't have a state NEPA. Its State Endangered Species Act is not particularly prohibitive, but because it's a small state, they're not very well resourced. They've developed no flexible permits under the Clean Air Act.
Wow.
So it's I think that's really what I would say. Texas, of course, is the example that everybody holds up as having taken a really good approach, and I think that's right. They have both a low limited regulations, and also have developed lots and lots of flexible permits, more than any other state. So yeah, I think it depending on the setup of the state, I suppose it looks different no matter where you go.
Well, right, and as it should, and so the work that you're doing is going to help these states sort of create those. And as you said, it's a playbook to sort of understand the best ways to grapple with this, sort of creating those policies, the best practices, as it were. I mean, that's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, and this is good. But let's sort of pull it back, because I know we're talking about energy quite a bit. I'm sure we could talk about manufacturing. We're talking about resource extraction, but one of the thorny issues is the issue of housing. And obviously, both the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act have both had incredible impacts on this. I mean, on the one hand, I get concerned with the greater federalization of local zoning laws, but on the other hand, talk about how the state implementation of ESA and Clean Water Act has impacted, if you can, the issue of housing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I will say I focus more on the nexus of these laws and energy infrastructure than I do with housing. But I do know, for example, that in Montana, there are all these folks, particularly during COVID, who moved to Montana from places like California. And so the pressure on new housing is enormous. And they're having a huge challenge with building new housing because of their state NEPA. And I don't, I think that their state Endangered Species Act in this case isn't the worst, but certainly their state NEPA has made it incredibly hard to build new housing. So yeah, for a lot of states, and frankly, particularly red states, which saw influxes of people in 2020, it feels existential, I think, in a lot of ways.
I think it very much is existentialism. I think that's why folks on both sides of the aisle have recognized that this is an issue. So let's pull it back and sort of turn our attention to some of the other things. As we're recording this, because we record in advance of when these things get released, you've just written a piece for the foundation about an efficiency agenda for the executive branch. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I should say that really Dan Lips, our head of policy, and Samuel Hammond, our senior economist, really took charge here.
By the way, I love Dan. He's terrific. He's good people.
He's great. Yeah, he's amazing. So we're really trying to chart opportunities for the executive branch to take control of out of control spending, really sort of the fiscal problems that that we continue to be heading towards and don't seem to be doing anything about. And so, going into 2025, who's to say what's going to happen, 5 days from now as we're recording here. But we really want to look at basically all the different levers that we can pull. So that looks at, we're looking at everything from using artificial intelligence to identify duplicative regulations, to looking at how have we made it difficult on federal land to develop, to how can independent agencies like the Government Accountability Office, play a role here.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I'm someone who still refers to the GAO as the General Accounting Office, because I don't think the government's gotten particularly any more accountable since they changed it over there. But that's the thing. It's got to be with a mind towards servicing better. And the issue of AI, Lord knows, one of the things, I'm doing the same thing in the policy work that I do, making these recommendations. You and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday, and the idea of using AI to ferret out the duplicative regulations, so vitally important, because most folks don't understand that you've got stuff that is happening, at the Interior Department, but also is being done by, frankly, folks at the Department of Labor and the EPA, and these are important things to sort of get at. So let me just let's pull back a little bit more, just to talk a little bit about you. I mean, you've been at this for a couple of months, but talk about how you got interested in this. I think that would be interesting for folks to sort of understand.
Yeah, I need to get better at figuring out what my origin story here is for getting so into this niche policy area. I think I grew up in a liberal family, which was and is thinks about climate change as sort of the issue that my parents really care about the most. And so I was interested in that issue from an early age, and naturally, I think. I got interested in energy and why we weren't deploying it more quickly from there. Over the course of high school and college, I drifted to the right. It really feels like permitting sits at the intersection of sort of where I came from and also, what I believe now, right? It's, it is this issue that makes it easier to build everything, including clean energy, and including all sorts of infrastructure. And it also I think it feels tangible in a way that sometimes other policy areas don't, right? It's, if you reduce this permitting barrier in Utah, somebody somewhere now can afford to, send their kid to college or can afford to start this new business or what have you. And I think having that direct, being able to see the direct impact of work that you're doing, I think is really gratifying in a way that I sense some other policy areas are not.
But let me ask you this. I mean, so you have a degree in mathematical sciences, which I think gives you a leg up on a lot of folks who don't have any sort of science background, but understanding how to do math is so vital. And I think so few people in the policy world ever do math. But did you have a eureka moment when you're at the University of Vermont? Did you say, oh my God, this is the work that I want to do? That take a specific class in public policy. I taught on the regulatory process. I think you and I have talked about this. And I wanted my students, and a handful of my students had that eureka moment. It's been a pleasure. I've worked with a couple of my former students. Did you have that eureka moment where it all sort of clicked for you and you said, this is what I want to do?
I think that there were a couple individual sort of anecdotes or stories that I ran into early in college that just drove me up the wall, right? So, I think about, for example, I'm a fan of nuclear energy, and a number of states have de facto or de jure bans on building new nuclear until the national waste problem, long-term waste or storage problem is solved.
Sure.
And you have the story in Yucca Mountain, right, where the U.S. government, after years of deliberating, lands on this spot to store spent nuclear fuel. So, but they begin the NEPA process. And 30 years later, they're still embroiled in that NEPA process, right?
That's the eureka moment. Got it. No, keep going, keep talking. This is a perfect example of this.
Right. So, it's this direct connection, right, between the way that NEPA works and the way that it's sort of able to be hijacked by sort of interest groups on the environmental left. And the fact that it's really, it stands in the way of building nuclear in states like California, right? California has enormous electricity demand. They have really aggressive, clean energy targets, but they've also banned building new nuclear because of reliance on a site that we can't get up and running because of NEPA, right? So
Right.
I think one other story that I like a lot is, the U.S. Forest Service wanted to develop a wildfire protection plan for an area of forest in Montana, but that too required NEPA review. And 2 years into the process of doing the NEPA for this wildfire protection plan, the area of forest burned down. Right, so the area of forest that the plan aimed to protect, they weren't able to do the controlled burns, and do whatever else they were planning to do to protect this forest because they were delayed by doing an environmental review before they could move forward. So little stories like that I think were what got me going.
So my dad's an environmental scientist, actually technically an occupational safety and health scientist. And I learned a great deal, still learn a great deal from my dad on the use of risk and the calculation of risk in creating policy. But what you are experiencing and learning about and studying is the manifestation of something that my dad says. Now, I used to say the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. And my dad simplified it for me. He said, Andrew, there are many roads to utopia. However, all must traverse the surface of the earth. So it's all well and good, right? It's all well and good to have this lengthy permitting process, and we should be deliberative. But if you're trying to create a plan to combat wildfires, the longer you take, the greater the risk of the wildfire happening. That is, the surface of the earth that you have to cross over. So Thomas, before I let you go, I like that we talked a little about your origin story, and that's a great one. Listen, that is having that eureka moment is so vitally important. But I like to ask folks about their outside interest because I was going to do a podcast where I was focusing on talking to policy people about what they do that's not policy or political related, because I think people want to know these things. So when you're not doing this work, what are you up to? What are some of your outside interests?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that takes up the most of my time outside of policy is rock climbing.
Okay.
So I've been obsessed with it since early high school, I suppose. For a long time, I thought that I was just going to be doing that for the rest of my life.
Sure.
When I graduated high school, I took a gap year. Bought myself actually, in fact, I went to the school that I went to, the college that I went to, because they provided enough aid that I was able to convince my parents that if I went to that school over another choice, which gave me less aid, they would buy me a Chevy Express 1500 all-wheel drive van that I could drive around the country in during my gap year to go rock climb.
Where'd you grow up?
So first half of my life in the Boston area, but second half in Oregon.
Okay. Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Wow. So you did the cross country trip over the course of a year to get from Oregon to the University of Vermont, which is a beautiful place to go to school. So any favorite places, during that gap year that you climbed? I mean, what sort of stands out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the amazing things about something like climbing is that it takes you to a lot of really beautiful places in the U.S. that you wouldn't 100%. Otherwise have gone to. Sometimes there'll just be boulders in a random state park somewhere in, Utah or Wyoming that, it's stunningly gorgeous. I think, let's see. I mean, I do love Utah. There's a town in the middle of Utah called Orangeville, which has, it turns out it's home to world-class rock climbing. But it also, before it was discovered as a rock climbing area, it was really a dying town. Everybody was moving out. It's in, I think, the least populous county in Utah. It's a lot of the mines have shut down. The industry has shut down, but it's really been revitalized by this industry and sort of really kind of met this new industry with open arms. So Utah. I think one story that I love is Utah. Of course, it's Mormon state, Emory County, where Orangeville is. Very Mormon county, and so Mormons don't drink coffee typically, but climbers certainly do. And so this climbing area, there used to not be a coffee shop for 90 miles in either direction. So this one family in Orangeville opened a coffee shop in their living room, even though they themselves don't drink coffee, and it's become this watering hole for rock climbers in the area. So anyway, yeah, that may be a personal favorite for me.
No. That's exactly what people need to hear. Orangeville, Utah. I will keep that because I'm thinking you're going to say Yosemite. I'm thinking you're going to say the Shongums, the Gunks in New York.
Those are great.
But no, Orangeville, Utah. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're living in and around the DC area now? Any place you go around DC to climb, or what are you doing that case?
Yeah, I mean, DC is no Oregon in terms of access to the outdoors, but Shenandoah National Park is about 2 hours west-southwest. And Maryland has some little spots in some pretty state parks like Catoctin. So yeah, still getting outside.
Anywhere where there's a rock face. And is this climbing? Obviously, this is what they call free climbing, where you're just scrambling up with a chalk bag.
Yeah, mostly bouldering, right? So sort of 10 to 20 foot tall boulders.
There you go. Well, listen, Thomas. So how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing at the Foundation for American Innovation?
Yeah, so you just go to the Foundation for American Innovation website. You can find all of our work there. You can also follow me on Twitter. I spend way too much time online at Thomas Hochman on Twitter.
Hochman. Yeah,
that's right.
Well, that's how you and I found each other. Or you reached out to me. So, Thomas, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour Federal Newswire. As I said, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can check us out on one of those many fine podcast platforms that's out there. We're available everywhere. If you're listening to us, go ahead and check us out on YouTube to see what we're talking about in studio. Subscribe, leave us a like, leave us a review, leave us a comment, and most importantly, spread the word of mouth. Let your friends and family members know how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.